Good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. Welcome, everyone, to the Climate Change and International Relations Fireside Talk series hosted by World Salon. We have a fantastic panel out here today, and let me just jump right in and start by introducing Jennifer Francis. I'll start by calling her on stage and sort of ask her to introduce herself. So yeah, Jennifer, why don't you take the floor there?
Okay, hi everyone. Yes, I'm Jennifer Francis. I'm a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts. I'm an atmospheric scientist. I've been mostly studying the Arctic in my career and how and why it's been changing, and more recently, how those changes in the Arctic have been affecting not just the people there, but a lot of us around the world.
All right, that's great. Michael, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Michael Bradbury. I'm a climate and science journalist based in Seattle. My work has appeared on PBS stations, MSNBC.com, Sirius Satellite Radio, Wired, the Seattle Times, and among other publications. I was an early podcast pioneer many years ago. I founded a couple of media companies, and right now, like Dr. Francis, I'm also focused on the Arctic. I'm working on a book project about Arctic climate resilience. And I'm also the president of the Northwest Science Writers Association and a member of other journalism organizations, including the Society of Environmental Journalists.
All right, that's great. And then let's move on to our next speaker, Fiona. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Fiona Harvey. I'm an environment editor of the Guardian newspaper.
All right, thank you. And then let's move on to Ruth. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit more about your background?
Sure, lovely to be here. My name is Ruth Greenspan Bell. I started as an environmental lawyer working on domestic issues. When I started working internationally, I brought that sensibility of someone who helped manage environment within the U.S. to the work I did globally. And since then, I've been working a lot on climate change governance issues.
All right, that's great. And then, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Marushi. My name is Chris Ayler. I'm a research fellow in the Environment and Society Centre at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs here in London. I work on international cooperation on climate change, recently been particularly focused on the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the energy transition and the ramifications of that for international relations. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. So why don't we move on to the first guided question for Jennifer? So Dr. Francis, your groundbreaking research on rapid Arctic warming has shown how polar changes can ripple through global weather systems. And in your view, what are the most pressing ways this science should inform international climate governance frameworks?
Well, thank you for that question that could take a long time to answer, but I'll try to be brief. And just a little background first on the Arctic itself, because not everyone realizes just how fast things are changing up there. It's actually warming 3 to 4 times faster than the globe as a whole. And that is having profound impacts on the people and animals and ecosystems there, including the fisheries, the indigenous people who live there, affecting their way of life, transportation, the infrastructure. Literally, the Arctic is melting before our very eyes. And those changes are also having a very widespread effect. So what happens in the Arctic does not stay there. We know there's a lot less sea ice and snow, and those very bright white surfaces, when we lose them, means that a lot more of the sun's energy is absorbed into the climate system. And this is creating an even faster warming globe because of losing those bright white surfaces. We're also losing the land ice, so the ice in the glaciers and the ice sheets. And that ice, when it melts, contributes directly to sea level rise, which we've seen accelerating over the last decade or so. The other kind of ice in the Arctic is the permafrost. So this is the frozen soil up there. And we know that's thawing rapidly as well. And when that happens, it releases more greenhouse gases into the air because all of the organic material that has been frozen for thousands of years in that soil is starting to decompose. So this is one of these vicious cycles that the Arctic contributes to and makes the globe even warmer. And getting into my own work, we're finding that the rapid warming up there in the Arctic is affecting weather patterns. It's affecting how the winds blow around the Northern Hemisphere. And sort of in a nutshell, we think that it's causing weather regimes to become more persistent. So whatever weather you have, whether it's hot or cold or rainy or dry, it's lasting longer. And that can in turn lead to a whole variety of extreme weather events like drought and heat waves, which are a deadly combination because those contribute to wildland fires, flooding events. These are all things that we think are linked to this rapid warming in the Arctic. But the question you're asking me is how this science really should be used or could be used to influence what governments do around the world. And I like to think of those influences in sort of two buckets. One is treating the disease, which is the underlying reason for all of these changes that are happening, not just in the Arctic, but elsewhere as well. And of course, we know what that disease is. It's because we just can't stop emitting these heat-trapping greenhouse gases. And so that's one of the very first things we need to really address is in reducing this disease. We also have to stop cutting down trees because they are the Earth's best natural way to extract that carbon out of the atmosphere. The other bucket is treating the symptoms of the disease. So this would be the extreme weather events, the rising sea levels, and helping people prepare for these increasing disturbances that we know are going to just get worse as we go forward into the future and causing a lot of disruptions to society, destroying lives, destroying livelihoods. And if we can prepare for these things in advance, it's much less expensive than recovering from extreme events when they happen. So it's really those two main buckets that I think we can help, the science can help understand what really needs to be done. And maybe a little more specifically, just take maybe one more minute. I think the scientists themselves can be really instrumental in helping dispel some of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there about the changes in the climate system and extreme weather. We still hear a lot of things said that just aren't true. We are the trusted sources for this information. We need to be more accessible and we need to get out there and communicate. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to some questions, more questions.
All right, thank you for that insightful answer. Does anyone have any additional comments or any follow-up questions for that? Okay, perfect. I think we can move on to the next guided question then, which is addressed to Michael. So your in-depth reporting highlights how climate misinformation campaigns can undercut public trust. So what strategies have you found most effective for countering these narratives and preserving the integrity of climate governance debates?
Well, thank you so much for such a thoughtful question. And again, it's one that we don't have time to explore in a lot of detail, but sort of where Dr. Francis left off, I'll pick up a little bit. I think that, and again, I'm looking at this through two kind of different lenses. One, as a journalist, who's trying to communicate with the public in a way that's effective and not, create misinformation or opportunities for misinformation while dispelling misinformation that is already out there. And then also I'm looking at this as a human, as part of, this great experiment of 8 billion people on this planet that are, basically changing our climate before our own eyes. So I have a vested interest in two different ways. From the journalistic perspective, I think that something that most journalists do and should do is making the stories relevant to daily life and localizing the data wherever possible. I like to say that data points don't make good stories, people do. So the science is very important, and it's sort of the underpinning of everything that's happening. But unfortunately, it's not terribly exciting reading. And I think that scientists have evolved to become good science communicators, to reach directly to the public where the media has failed, and also working in partnership with the media to tell the right stories in the right way, with the right context and the right perspective, but in a way that also resonates with the audience. And I think one of the ways to do that is also through telling personal stories. So the stories of people who've been affected by the changes in the Arctic and elsewhere really makes the story come to life for people. Telling good news stories, the good things that are happening where people are taking climate action and having success and making a difference in their communities and in their lives. People tune out bad news. We're surrounded by bad news, especially in the United States. It's a constant flow, and the tendency is just to ignore it. And sometimes we're ignoring it at our peril, but we're also doing that as a way to maintain our sanity and to just go on with the next day. So there are some reasons that we are not drawn to bad news. And the story of climate for so long has been nothing but bad news. Every year we break records. Every year those records are, consigned to the dustbin of history, and new records replace them, and baselines start shifting over time, and people don't have any way of processing what that means. So to put the stories in context of people's lives and focusing more on the solution rather than just the problem. The problem is important because it sets the stage for what we're talking about, and gives rise to why we need solutions. But there's a whole movement in climate and environmental journalism, but not just in journalism, also more broadly, to focus on solutions journalism, which is journalism that is making a difference, that is assessing whether proposed solutions or ways to solve a problem are valid, are accurate, actually do work, being critical about it, not just adopting an idea that people think is a great solution, but looking at it to make sure that that is the case. And I think, this will probably be a more controversial answer, but my own personal perspective as a journalist is that I think we need to make climate change more fun. The climate crisis is kind of a downer. It's not buzzy. It doesn't include pop culture. We need to start involving influencers, social media influencers. Yes, it's true. They have to be trusted and vetted and working in partnership, in collaboration, but they have the audiences, and the audiences are craving content, and these influencers are content creators at heart. So if we can figure out how to make the climate more exciting and more enticing and more important to these audiences, then we're reaching people who are just not getting reached through newspapers, through beautifully written long form articles in the New Yorker, seeing documentaries, or even getting little snips on TikTok. But I think that's kind of where we're really missing out, and also making, again, climate change more fun, but trying to find joy. I mean, we're going to be doing this decarbonization thing globally for the next 30 years, if we're lucky, and beyond. And so we all are going to have to, get it through our heads that we can't sit on the sidelines. This is affecting all of us, and it's also a great opportunity to bring our own talents and unique skills to bear on the problem, and then see what cool stuff we can do. I mean, we have to imagine the entire global energy system in, one generation or two, and that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of people, and it's something we've not done, and it's hard. And so we might as well try to figure out how to find some joy along the way. And then looking at the whole problem of climate misinformation, and I'll kind of merge misinformation and disinformation for the purposes of what I'm referring to. But just so everybody knows, misinformation is just passing along wrong information. There's no intent behind it. It's somewhat innocent. And this happens all the time on social media. Someone makes a meme, posts a post, misquotes somebody, and that just gets spread like wildfire. There's no campaign or operation involved with that. That's where disinformation comes in, where it's a deliberate intent. There's bad actors involved. There's money involved. There's a vested interest in either, keeping the false debate of climate change alive, which happened, well before social media for many years, or if there's, more nefarious activities associated with maintaining the status quo. So I think that it's important to distinguish between those two, but for this purpose, I'll just talk about misinformation as kind of a lumped in idea. So I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller. Scientists are also storytellers. They're publishing research and sharing that information with decision makers, governments, the public. And we're all like trying to get the message out about climate change. That's the agenda, is just telling people what's happening. We're holding up a mirror to people's faces and letting them see the reality in front of them. Now, there's something called rival storytelling, which falls more in the misinformation category, where there's disingenuous intent. The purpose is to deny, to stall, to oppose scientific stories in unproductive and harmful ways. A lot of those rival storytellers are supported by well-funded and powerful groups. They have a stake in keeping the controversy alive or maintaining that status quo. So the stories of people doing things, I think solutions journalism, again, gets into that realm, as well as an organization called Covering Climate Now, which is a journalism startup that began in 2019, basically to get more climate stories into the news, into the media, and it's grown into a larger organization. In fact, today they launched a new initiative called the 89% Project. And this is based on the idea that globally, 89% of the world's population, that's a lot of people, and a massive, overwhelming majority of these people want their governments to do more. They want more climate action. They want to see activities that are going to promote the green energy transition. And the sad thing is, they think that they're alone. They're 89%. We are 89% of the world. Yet we feel like, oh, so many people don't want this action. So many governments are dragging their heels, where they think their constituents don't support climate action. And so this project is to sort of dispel that myth and have a concentrated week of, they call it a surge in media activity around climate change that's going to coincide next month with Earth Day. So right around April 20th. So there'll be an increase in a lot of coverage. And Fiona, I'm sure you can speak about this a little bit more involved, because The Guardian is involved in this as well as up to 600 other news partners around the world that Covering Climate Now works with. And so then the final point I wanted to make, which is sort of the end of this question, which was what strategies that I find effective for countering narratives and preserving the integrity of climate governance debates. Now, I was thinking about what climate governance debates would entail, and it's a very large category. So I kind of broke it down into 3 ideas, which we can talk about more on the panel, which is that those conversations and activities need to be conducted in good faith and with transparency. And I think that's something that right now we're ceding a lot of power and a lot of time and energy to bad faith actors, and then having to counter their activities in order to get back to good faith activities. So I think that's number 1. And then we just need to keep the big picture in mind. We have to transform the entire global energy system to clean green power within 30 or 40 years. And the bottom line is, not that many people care about the science specifically, which sort of breaks my heart. But the reality is it's getting hotter. We know that fossil fuels are behind it and the reason that that's happening. And that's all that the world really needs to know. So that's kind of the big picture. And then finally, I will say that a lot of the decision making at the policy level must be continually conducted based on science-based decision making. Now, a lot of people want to base their decisions on vibes. I don't think that the climate crisis will tolerate that. And right now, of course, the US is in danger of getting rid of the government apparatus at every agency that uses science and data for rulemaking, for decision making, guidance, and for policy recommendations. So I will just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I really loved your concept and your idea of, making climate change fun. I think that was like a really nice idea. And I think it's really important to, incorporate today's like social media influence with climate change. And with that, does anyone have any comments or any other questions? Okay, great. I think let's move on to the next guided question then. Fiona, having witnessed the evolving media landscape around climate coverage, how can journalists balance the need to simplify complex negotiations like COP summits without losing critical nuances for the public?
Hello. Yes, well, we've just heard quite a lot about climate journalism. I think the thing is that actually you need to have people who are engaged. You need to have the political will to actually do something about the climate crisis. And that is what is really lacking. I mean, we have all of the technology that we need to tackle the climate crisis. We've known for decades about what is happening. We've had warning after warning, and still people are not acting. And they're not acting with sufficient strength. So at COPs, the question was about COPs. Every year we have UN Climate COP. We've had them for the last 30 years. And not a great deal seems to come from these COPs most of the time. Greta Thunberg has called them blah, blah, blah. And it's very, very difficult to see that we will make enough progress from holding COPs every year to actually solve the climate crisis. We won't, quite simply, we won't. So although COPs are necessary to solve the climate crisis, because without them, we wouldn't have any global forum in which to bring together all of the world's governments to talk about this, they're not sufficient. And actually, we need action outside of COPs as well as inside COPs. One of the critical actions that we could take outside COPs is to look at some specific greenhouse gases. So we're all focused on carbon dioxide because that is the main greenhouse gas. But if we looked at methane, for instance, then we could do an awful lot in quite a short time. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, about 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in warming the planet. And it comes from oil and gas exploration, it comes from agriculture, it comes from waste. And if we were to cut down our emissions of methane substantially, then it would do more to halt or slow temperature rises in the short term than cutting carbon dioxide, because because as I said, it's such a powerful greenhouse gas. It turns out that it's relatively straightforward to reduce a lot of these methane emissions. For instance, a lot of methane is produced from fracking operations, and just putting into place more stringent regulations on how you do fracking or how you do oil and gas extraction, not allowing people to vent and flare methane, asking them to capture it. This turns out to be not only relatively straightforward, but can also, because of the price of natural gas at the moment, can actually save companies money or make them money if they do this. So that is a step that we could be taking right now in all countries across the world. Doesn't need 30 years of COPs to achieve that. You could just do it. And really, we need to be taking steps like that as soon as possible. Otherwise, well, we're going to be sunk. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Fiona, for that. And does anyone have any follow-up comments or any questions or anything? Okay, great. I think we can address them towards the end, then when we move towards a more general discussion. So my next question was to Ruth. Your 2022 opinion piece called for rethinking the United Nations COP climate negotiations. Where do you see the most significant weaknesses in the current COP process, and what specific reforms might spark more genuine international cooperations?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for setting up this interesting forum. I want to be totally clear because probably a lot of people here haven't read what I wrote. So I just want to be very clear about this. I do question the efficacy and the worth of the negotiations at this stage, but I want to be totally clear. This is not because this is not an existential threat. It's exactly because this is a threat that we're facing that really has a lot to do with the future of humanity on this globe. And we're really not doing much about it in real terms. So I want to sort of build on something Fiona said and sort of maybe slightly tack in a slightly different direction. You know, the more candid or more adventurous scientists are saying the Earth is starting to actually go into kind of a form of a shutdown mode. The UN negotiations started in about 1992. And at the beginning there, when we were all in Brazil, the parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2 was 356.54 ppm. The latest measurement that I'm aware of in 2024 was 424.61 parts per million. So we're definitely going absolutely the wrong direction. The international process includes an awful lot of countries, obviously, with wildly differing objectives. And we have not even been able to agree, really, until theoretically at the last COP, whether we're even all talking about fossil fuels or whether we're all on the same page about fossil fuels. And that's a minor problem, right? You know, the classic definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I feel like that's kind of where we are at this stage. We're in a period of farce almost, where COPs are hosted by countries and people and chaired by people who don't believe that fossil fuels pose a threat. So, you know, and now we're in a situation where the United States, with the current administration, is at best, you know, kind of an elephant in the corner of the room who actually has the most influence and sway in the discussion. So we're kind of in a bad place. One of the things I've worried about with the COPs is whether the regularity of the meetings, the pronouncements that come out of it, because everybody who runs a COP is desperate to say that it has been a successful COP, that it's moved the issues forward, whether all of this gives a false sense of confidence or security or an illusion of progress to people who have concerns but don't follow climate closely. And I think one of the places we've been most derelict in this process is kind of leaving the impression that this is an issue that should be left to the experts. And again, the COP sort of reinforces that. A bunch of experts get together, pronounce, and then supposedly go off and work on things. So I do think there are parts of the COP that could be redeemed. I think having helped manage one COP, and I don't go to COPs anymore, but having been to a number of them, to me, the most useful parts of them are the side events. That's where you learn about the state of the art, you learn science, you meet people. These sort of hallway discussions, I think, are much more candid and much more open and informative than the stuff that goes on in the meeting room. You may remember Copenhagen, which a lot of people thought was a smashing failure. But in fact, that was one of the few COPs where there were actually candid discussions among the leadership there. And eventually it led to the Paris Agreement. And if we didn't have Trump, the Paris Agreement would be tooling along in pretty fine shape, at least in my opinion. I think where we have really missed out, and I think this is my major point, is what people can do rather than just what experts can do. And let me give you an example just of my own country of something people can do. Clothes dryers. Clothes dryers are 6% of US emissions. In 1955, only 10% of US households had one. Today, the number of US households that have a clothes dryer is in the 80+% range. Only 56% of UK households have clothes dryers, and in the European Union, it's more like 30% of a total of about 200 million households that have clothes dryers. These are just machines to send carbon off to the sky. And there's side benefits to line drying, which is your textiles will last longer and they're not stretched out of shape. Another example, on my morning walk, I routinely pass 3 to 5 vehicles, trucks, buses, cars that are unnecessarily idling. Ending car and truck idling would rid society of another unnecessary 1.6%. And at the same time, it would save gas, save money, cut back other pollutants, and do us a lot of good health benefit favors. Probably 12 years ago, Mike Vandenberg wrote an article about the impact of idling and how that could be an opportunity for people who want to sort of start gradually cutting back emissions. We could eliminate or significantly reduce food waste, and that would eliminate from the US point of view, eliminate the equivalent of the annual CO2 emissions of 42 coal-fired power plants. We could compost what's left and put a significant dent in methane emissions that contribute 80 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide, as Fiona has pointed out. And then my next and last suggestion is quite ambitious. Why don't we resist the most recent tech temptations? This effort to sort of internalize AI into all our lives has huge energy and water costs, and we're not facing up to that. And most people who use that technology haven't spent any time worrying about that. Data centers are growing proportions of our energy consumption. So I will leave it at that, but I actually think there's a lot of room for people to engage in this as well as governments to engage. I think we have not really, the assumption underlying, I think, the way we've handled it to date is that we can lead exactly the same kind of lives we've been leading, but just changing the energy source. I don't think, if you look at that carefully, that holds water anymore. I would be really interested in talking about all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and especially for giving solutions that people could easily, apply to, cut off on emissions and sort of help towards this. So does anyone have any other questions or any follow-up comments or anything? or should we move on to the last guided question? Okay, I think let's move on to the last guided question for Chris. So, based on your work exploring various modes of climate change cooperation, what innovative mechanisms or partnerships might help transcend traditional geopolitical rivalries to achieve unified climate action?
Thanks very much for this great question. I really appreciate going last so I can absorb what everyone else has said. Some really great insights so far and lots to think about.
Yeah.
So yes, I'd like to highlight two possibilities really for climate change cooperation that go beyond the annual COPs. And I totally agree with the analysis of my fellow panelists about that. It's necessary, valuable in some respects, but really nowhere near enough, particularly at this stage. So the first one I'd like to highlight is practical cooperation on specific challenges, practical cooperation between countries on specific challenges. So this might take the form of scientific cooperation, understanding the risks of climate change that we need to prepare for, technical cooperation, so calibrating the systems needed for decarbonisation, which are incredibly complicated, and the policies needed to actually make it happen on the ground. This sort of practical cooperation is not especially sexy or innovative, but it's urgently needed so we can move from arguing about targets and responsibilities to really implementing it and getting on with the job. So I can talk a little bit about cooperation on climate change between the UK and China. Where I work, Chatham House has been bringing together experts and officials from both sides for dialogues of this nature for a couple of decades now. So just to point to one area of cooperation that we identified as really potentially valuable, that's to do with phasing out coal and phasing in renewable energy to the electricity system. So the UK has been really world leading in this respect. Over the last 15 years or so, it's kicked out coal from its electricity generation, brought in huge amounts of renewables, mainly offshore wind, and it's done this in a smooth way that, you know, the average consumer wouldn't necessarily have noticed it. And it's done this through a sort of package of policies, technical measures, reforms to the electricity market. Again, none of this is particularly sexy. You wouldn't have heard about it in the news, but it's been important, and it's, you know, it means that the UK is actually really doing quite a good job on decarbonisation, certainly in terms of its electricity grid. China, for its part, has deployed just gargantuan amounts of renewable energy, solar panels, wind farms, everything you can think of, really. And why we see opportunity for them to sort of build on their complementary strengths, the two countries, is that the UK is very good at integrating this technology into its grid, whereas China has been very, very good at putting the policies in place that actually allow it to be rolled out. So, for example, we would talk to China about measures like low carbon contracts for difference, carbon floor mechanisms on the electricity grid that have allowed the UK to bring this stuff onto the grid. So China's got a lot, but it's not making the full use out of this renewable energy. So what we advocate for is UK sort of policy experts, officials speaking with their Chinese counterparts on the really sort of technical side of bringing all this renewable energy onto the grid. And we feel that could have huge emissions reduction potential, with China being the biggest current emitter by a long way. So that's just one example. And the thing, of course, is that in the kind of current moment, there's seriously sort of tense geopolitics, and the UK's relationship with China has deteriorated over the last decade or so. But what we've found with this in terms of climate change is that the two countries don't really necessarily need to be allies in the traditional sense. What's more important than them being allies is that there's alignment on a few key things. And we'd identify that as ambition. So the UK has high climate ambition. It's aiming for an 81% reduction in emissions by 2035 based on 1990 levels, which is generally regarded as one of the most ambitious in the world at the moment. China, for its part, as I say, is targeting 60% by 2060 carbon neutrality. And that is a huge challenge for a country like China, which has been developing so fast, mainly on coal so far. So both UK and China have these incredibly ambitious targets, but it's also backed up by action, credible action. So as I say, the UK has had these targets, but it's managed to meet all its targets until now in terms of carbon budgets and so on. So it's actually backed it up with credible action. China has done the same. Basically, as I mentioned, China has rolled out world-beating quantities of solar photovoltaics, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. More than half of new cars sold in China today are zero carbon from the tailpipe electric vehicles. So there's been really, really credible action on that. And that's because China wants to decarbonize. It doesn't want to have to import fossil fuels and be dependent. So there's this alignment in terms of ambition and action, which is really important. And I think a final one is the UK and China both generally have a kind of evidence-based scientific approach to climate change. We sort of discovered that over the years we've been working with them on climate risk assessment. So there's this respect for the kind of method of understanding it, building risk assessments, building that into policies. China's very careful about setting targets it doesn't think it can meet, so it's very keen on getting the evidence prepared to understand it. So in terms of the UK and China working together on climate change, there's this alignment of ambition, action, and scientific approach, which I think speaks a little bit to what Michael and Fiona were both saying about political will. So you're not just talking with kind of bad actors and wasting your time. So this is why, for example, I don't think the UK should cooperate with Russia on climate change, because I think they generally show themselves to be a bad actor in that respect. But also respect for science and the importance of science. What's interesting about this mode of cooperation is there's the potential for it to scale up. You can say, okay, the UK and China work together on climate change, that can be expanded to other countries. And then you start to broaden a kind of coalition of countries that are broadly interested in tackling climate change. And that might not just be for reducing emission. That might not just be for reducing climate impacts, which is obviously very important, but there's a lot of benefits from clean energy security benefits, which are really being talked about a lot more now. You don't have to rely on fossil fuel imports, and jobs in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And yeah, this expansive coalition is what the UK's Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, has been in Beijing this week, trying to start. The UK is kind of like back on the stage as a climate leader, certainly trying to be, and has been trying to build this broad coalition of climate action, particularly in the context of the US having retreated. Just one more mode of climate cooperation, if I may just mention, which is a really interesting one. My colleague at Chatham House, Bernice Lee, has called sharing the green industrial pie, which I really like as a phrase. So as I mentioned, it's well known that China has become overwhelmingly dominant in clean technology. In some ways, that's a good news story because it's massively increased our chances of avoiding catastrophic climate change by bringing the cost of the technology down. But of course, it's also seriously exacerbated trade tensions, and it's led to policies in the US and Europe to reshore manufacturing and to punishing tariffs to prevent cheap Chinese clean technology coming in, which is understandable on a certain level from industrial policy, but it is bad news for the climate. It slows it down, makes the transition more expensive. So what we're kind of identifying from some of our work at Chatham House is a growing trend of, if you want to sell here, you need to invest here. So in practice, that's like manufacturing partnerships between Chinese clean technology companies who are at the cutting edge of a lot of clean technologies and emerging economies. So in practice, this is Chinese companies striking deals to build clean technology factories, especially electric vehicle manufacturers, in countries like Brazil, in countries like Turkey, in countries like Indonesia. And we even heard that Germany is apparently thinking about agreeing a BYD factory, electric vehicle factory, in the near future. It's on the cards. Of course, these deals, there's a lot of problems with them potentially. They need to be fair, they need to be structured right, they need to have conditions that make sure that certain standards are followed. There's security concerns. There's a lot to think about on that front, and particularly around technology transfer, because it's all very well Chinese companies come over and bring this technology, but they're just using the location as a basis for it. That's one thing. But if there's actual proper sort of technology transfer, then you can see that this green industrial pie, the economic benefits of the transition start to be spread a little more around the world. And with these countries, as I say, like Brazil, Turkey, and so on, that are kind of big countries, and they're becoming more important in the in our new world that we're moving into, more multipolar world. We think that's a really interesting development, and we're going to be watching it closely. And basically, it makes us think that if the economic benefits of the energy transition are shared, it's much more likely to proceed at the pace we need it to stem some of the terrible impacts of climate change that we know we're facing, and that some of my co-panelists have alluded to. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. I think collaboration between, ambition and action sort of, I do agree with your point, can lead to, combating climate change. So does anyone have any additional comments or any questions or anything? All right, I think with that, we can move towards our general discussion forum. Does anyone want to sort of take the lead there in terms of is there any specific topic or anything that anyone wants to dive deeper into?
I've got one. It kind of follows up on both Fiona and Chris's comments. So Fiona talked about methane as one of the near-term solutions that we could really pull the trigger and make a big change in terms of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere in a short time. And goodness knows we need to find some ways to do this quickly, because I was just reading today that, in fact, this past year, the rate of increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was the highest it's ever been. So it's not just the amount, it's the pace that we're increasing this in the atmosphere. So on that topic of near-term action, I wanted to ask Chris, actually, I noticed in your bio that you have thought a lot about subsidies, especially to the fossil fuel industry. And this has been something that I've always thought was another one of these near-term things that we could do like tomorrow. Could you talk a little bit about some specifics of the kinds of subsidies that exist now, the amounts of money? I understand that some of the subsidies, even though the numbers in terms of dollars is huge, but some of it goes to exploration and infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry, which to me seems absolutely insane because they're making record profits. But also some of it goes to help people pay their fuel bills. So can you kind of put that into perspective? Because this is something that I would like to understand better myself, and I'm really glad to have an expert here to ask.
Well, thanks very much for the question. So yes, my knowledge of fossil fuel subsidies isn't as up to date as I'd like it to be. However, I do know that when you talk about fossil fuel subsidies, it covers a lot of different things. And in some ways, much as like with climate finance, when you talk about climate finance, and it covers so many different things, you know, mitigation, adaptation, loans, grants, and in some ways it's not that helpful. I think with fossil fuel subsidies, so sometimes you hear these really shocking numbers about fossil fuel subsidies, and that is often due to the incorporation of the externalities, the damage that's being caused in terms of climate change, in terms of, for example, road deaths, air pollution, and so on and so forth. And then there's obviously the sort of more that's sometimes added on to the more direct subsidies and kind of tax breaks and things like fossil fuel companies not being required to sort of clean up abandoned wells and so on and so forth. And that's kind of on the product. So you've kind of got the indirect fossil fuel subsidies, which sort of damages, and then you've got the direct production subsidies, which are sort of like almost, you know, tax breaks and the rest of it. And then you have, as you say, the consumption subsidies, which are basically sort of bringing down the price, say at the pump for consumers. And actually, in my work, I sort of did a comparison of the two different types, and they're quite different, really. They're quite different mechanisms. And I think, yeah, the idea that you could just, it does seem like such low-hanging fruit, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, but it's very, very difficult. Yeah, the political economy of removing consumer subsidies on fossil fuels, as you see in many, many countries around the world, leads to huge flare-ups. And you have to be very, very careful about how it's done. And you have seen some countries manage to do it. There's a whole load of best practice information out there about how you can do it and remove it. But when cost of living is such a big issue now, if you suddenly jack up the price that people are paying, like, to get to work, that can, you know, really be, you know, ignite a serious fire. And it's a shame because the benefits of fossil fuel subsidies accrue mainly to the rich because they are using more fossil fuels, more carbon intensive, and so on and so forth. So it's really, really fiendish. You do see some good work happening around, but I personally think you have to be so careful about increasing fuel prices for people. In the UK, like the net zero and the energy transition is often blamed for high electricity prices, and it's complete nonsense because it's to do with the price of gas, basically the volatile price of gas, and we're very dependent on that, but it can easily be misrepresented. So I actually think the real thing should be like producer subsidies on that side and really getting into that, and that does probably require politicians with a bit more backbone to challenge these vested interests. But I'd love to talk a little bit more about it. I don't want to dominate, but it's a fascinating subject, and I do hope that we can start to move away from that, because it could unlock a lot of money which could be better spent.
All right, that's great. Does anyone have any follow-up comments or any other questions or anything, any other topic that they want to sort of dive deep into? Or should we move to the audience questions? Okay, I think let's move on to the audience questions then. Okay, so there's this question from Anna H. She says that how does climate change, her question is that how does climate change influence global power dynamics and the potential for international cooperation or conflict? Does anyone want to sort of answer that question?
I can take a stab at that.
Okay.
I think that, it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. The climate change is causing or influencing global power dynamics, and some of those global power dynamics are also influencing climate change at the same time. I think that in broad strokes, I'm on the cooperation side of the fence. I think the overarching question for this fireside chat was, cooperation versus competition. So I think ultimately we'll land at cooperation, but I think we're not there yet. And we've had a lot of great strides, especially since 2015, but we're going backwards right now because of some of those geopolitical issues that are driving these power dynamics. And the folks who are desperately trying to maintain the status quo and to keep fossil fuels flowing are not going to go quietly. And I think that there are more of us than there are of them. But we also need them to come to the table at some point, because they've been producing energy for hundreds of years. So they know how to do it. I don't. I think that climate change itself is destabilizing governments in very broad strokes. There's a lot of examples. The one I frequently point to is the fact that, droughts that cause famines that destabilize ways of lives in Middle Eastern countries. Syria is a great example. During a major drought that led to a famine, millions of people, or 1.2 million people, moved from rural lands that were kind of dried up because they had no livelihoods anymore, and they moved to cities. They were not city dwellers, and then the cities became overcrowded. People became frustrated and angry, and ultimately, civil war broke out. So you could say, and then that led to a refugee crisis, which, flooded Europe and other places with displaced people who couldn't go back to their homes because initially there was a drought that caused a famine. And it's this whole cycle that climate change is sort of the seed of many of these things. And you can point to destabilizing factors all over the world, from Sudan to Southeast Asia, and in some ways to the United States as well.
Could I comment on that?
Yes, go ahead.
I think what Michael said is totally correct, but here's the problem I see. The people who study the science or read it, read the IPCC reports and all that, are fully aware that the growing accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is causing major wild distortions in leading to, droughts getting worse and longer, water events being more powerful and more destructive. But to everyone else on the planet, this is just weather. It's not happy weather, it's not pleasant weather, but it's something they've experienced all their lives. And it's, in that sense, normal. And I don't think well beyond the people who follow these issues carefully that enough people understand or have even the tools to understand why this isn't just normal weather, and how you associate that back with this problem we're talking about. And to me, that's like a core conundrum in all this discussion.
And I think that's why communication is so important. And when Michael talked about, making it personal and finding opportunities where people are listening, where you can grab them while they're paying attention and help them understand, yes, this is a terrible weather event that just happened to you, but here's what we know about why this particular type of event is going to happen more often, is happening more often. And I like to think of this as sliding spinach into a cheeseburger. People are fascinated by extreme weather events, and so they're paying attention, they're watching their TVs. And then if you have somebody who can explain to them, okay, well, the research suggests that these kinds of things are going to happen more often, and here's why. I think those opportunities, it's not exactly the joy that Michael was talking about to grab people, but it is something that I think is actually quite effective. A silver lining of all this extreme weather, if you will.
Yeah, that's correct. Does anyone have any other final comments or any questions, or we can move on to the next audience question? Okay, so there's one from Grace that what are the most effective international agreements addressing climate change, and how have they evolved over time?
Maybe it's worth someone giving a short primer on the UNFCCC.
Yeah.
I mean, I can try to do that if you want.
Okay.
Grace, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but in about 1992, the world started a kind of a global negotiation, which is now involving what it is, 196 or 198, something like that, parties to this, where throughout the whole year and then culminating in a big annual conference, they try to negotiate all the complex issues that are associated with climate change, including how did it happen, what do you do about it, how do you think about the folks who are being damaged by it, who don't have the resources to manage the considerable damage that is being inflicted on them. A whole series of agreements or issues that are being addressed in an international forum. It's a very cumbersome process because it involves the entire globe and every country on it representing all the people who live on this globe. And each one of those countries has quite different interests. Some of them, their entire economy is rooted in fossil fuels. And on the other extreme, there are countries like the island nations who are, as we speak, seeing the terrible costs to their countries and to their people, even though they weren't the folks who were most responsible for these buildup of greenhouse gases. So that's where you would focus if you're talking about, international agreements. And I think, there's some debate about how effective they are. I kind of stated my position earlier that that it's hard to point to a lot of progress if the core issue is reversing the flow of greenhouse gas emissions. But there are certainly kind of, I guess, other measures other people might think are important too. And I would leave that to other people here to talk about that.
All right. Thank you, Ruth, for taking that question up. We can move to the next question. I think someone has written that it's from an anonymous, and they've said that how can nations align national interests with global environmental goals to ensure long-term cooperative solutions? Does anyone? Yeah.
I'm happy to have a go at that.
All right.
Well, I think it's the sort of million, billion, trillion-dollar question, really, particularly as we move into an age where national interest seems to be taking more prominence than ever. We had a period where the sort of liberal international order, which certainly in rhetorical terms was about sort of the common good. Although you could probably argue whether, national interest was really basically driving everything. It's going to really depend on the country, is my view. I think to sort of pick up on a word that was in the question that was posed to me, unified climate action. I actually increasingly think that is largely, we shouldn't be aiming for that anymore, because there's simply too many potential sort of losers from tackling climate change. And these are really, the countries and the companies whose business models and sort of almost existence as countries to some extent is predicated on burning fossil fuels and generating greenhouse gases. And I think what you've seen at a lot of the COPs that we've talked about is you get this kind of minimum level agreement, which is you just about manage to get those countries and those people who are really committed to continuing to burn fossil fuels to agree to it. And then it means that you end up with solutions which are not really solutions. And there's a lot of debate about technologies like carbon capture and so on, which the fossil fuel industry is very keen on because they think it will allow them to continue burning fossil fuels. There's also a lot of evidence showing that very unlikely that that's going to be really feasible and is going to be problematic in myriad ways. So I think that what it really is at this point in time is we say we've probably tried 30 years of trying to get sort of like, unified climate action to happen. And we had some successes in it. I don't want to sort of overstate it. There's been some real successes through the COPs, but I think it's now about building really strong coalitions, not sort of coalitions of the willing, but coalitions that are actually going to really do things and that want to act on this. And it doesn't need to be for altruistic reasons. It doesn't need to be to, save the planet. It's a term that I increasingly sort of shy away from a bit, save the planet, because it seems too sort of utopian. This is more sort of about, to survive, which is, it's hard to get people to grapple with that. But you just say, look, what would be of benefit to our country, to our economies, to our people? If you're a politician, if you're a government, even if you're unelected, you want to make sure that, you don't want your people to be sort of subject to climate disasters and all the destabilization and so on. So I think it's about finding the countries that really do want to do this. And I'm quite positive that I'm quite sort of optimistic that most countries and representing a broad swathe of the world do want to do this. I was kind of encouraged that obviously the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. We knew it was going to happen. It's been followed by only one other country really even talking about it, and they haven't, Argentina. And I think Argentina is a really sort of special case for different reasons. I think broadly, the rest of the world thinks we should sort of do this. I think Russia, again, is a slightly special case because they are so dependent on, fossil fuel revenues, and they've really got no interest in the energy transition. So there again, another case, but plenty of other countries really do want to do this. And a lot of the time it's for energy security reasons. They don't want to be dependent on US fossil fuel exports. They don't want to be dependent on Russian fossil fuel exports. They don't want to be dependent on fossil fuel exports from the Middle East. So what you're seeing is a lot of countries getting together and sort of talking to each other and saying, how can we sort of move ahead with this, even where there's all these headwinds? So I think it is possible to align it. I think it's difficult, but I think there are probably a lot of interesting cooperative conversations going on at all sorts of different levels at the moment, which you won't be hearing about, but which will be forging new coalitions of people and officials and politicians and so on and so forth. Sometimes they have to say something slightly different in public, but I think we're going to see the fruits of that, because what's happened with the US withdrawing, it's been a real shock to the global system. And there's a lot of people now thinking, what can we actually do? And as Michael has rightly pointed out, we're in the vast majority of the people on this planet want to sort this problem out and would like a habitable planet for them, for their children and their grandchildren.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, for that and for answering that question. We have one more question from the audience, and That is, what will be the key milestones for climate action in the future? Does anyone want to sort of take that question up, or? Okay, I think we can maybe move to the next question. I think we did discuss that, throughout.
I was just trying to discuss, but can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can hear
great.
you. Yeah.
Well, in terms of milestones, we have a milestone coming up this year, which is the COP30 meeting, because under the Paris Agreement, all countries have got to update their national plans for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So unless all countries produce national plans that would take us to the sufficient emissions cuts to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating on top of pre-industrial levels, then we're not fulfilling the promises that have been made at recent COPs. So that, I think, is the biggest, most important milestone that we have coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for that. I think, yes, the Paris Agreement is sort of like a highlight right now, especially in respect to climate change and international relations.
I would just like to add, there's a milestone that is very simple and easy to measure, and that is just to have the concentration, the amount of heat trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop increasing. Because when that happens, then most of the warming, most of the change is also going to stop. So, I mean, that's just simple, and we can measure that very easily. But that's what's got to happen before, and if we don't, it's going to continue to get worse. It's going to continue to warm. It's going to continue to melt ice and cause more extreme events and cause more disruption to governments and agriculture and water sources and all of that. So to me, that's the biggest key milestone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That sort of highlights that how simple and easy it is to, keep track of what we're doing and how we can, sort of help the environment. Okay, does anyone have any other follow-up comments or questions, or should I move on to our last audience question? Okay, let me move on to our last audience question, and that is, what are the biggest obstacles to international cooperation on climate change? I think we did talk about this, but does anyone want to have a go at it?
Sure, I'll take this, and then anybody else can chime in. I think the biggest obstacle, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is political will. We have the science, we have the technological know-how. What we don't have is a unified position that we need to stop this and stop the climate crisis as quickly as possible. So I think political will is the number one obstacle, and that is very evident right now in the actions of the United States. And I just will share very briefly that I was at an international Arctic climate science meeting last fall in Iceland, and I was of the belief that our vice president was going to be elected president, and a lot of the climate policies would continue as they had for the last couple of years. Largely, a lot of the folks there, especially the UN diplomats and the other high-ranking people from NATO and other places in the know, sort of thought that it was a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump would win re-election. And so I was a little bit dismissive of many of them. And then, of course, after the election, I went back to my notes and the conversations that I had with people and sort of thought, okay. And it settled me a little bit, because I realized that despite everything that a lot of people in the United States are going through right now and trying to figure out, what we can do, what we can, prevent from being lost or destroyed or damaged, the rest of the world is pretty unified in this idea that the work that has been done will continue. So that is somewhat heartening that, all is not lost because of our current presidential administration. There's a lot of work that has been, a lot of groundwork that has been laid through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the IRA, and the Science and Chips Act in the last 4 years. And those have also become models for other countries that they can see how the United States was able to create these policies and put them into action that are being done in other countries. So in that respect, sort of the climate policy cat is out of the bag. And I'm very excited to see what the rest of the world does without the United States as a primary leader.
If I could just follow up on that. And I think we seem to be wrapping up, so I always love to end on a happy note if possible. But getting back to something that Ruth said in the end of her comments, and that was just how much individuals can do to help turn this big ship around. You talked about, food waste and just not using as much energy as an individual, but there's also a lot I think individuals can do in their own communities, whether it's getting onto the planning board for your town or figuring out where your climate vulnerabilities are, what specific climate change related vulnerabilities you have in your community, and then help figure out how to mitigate some of those. So that gets back to what I was saying about treating the symptoms and getting ahead of becoming more resilient, really. And I see a lot of really positive work, getting back to what Michael was saying, at the community level, and really helping these communities deal with whatever risk it is that affects them. And it varies a lot from one community to the next. Coastal communities, of course, are facing sea level rise and storms, whereas more continental communities, it's more about drought, perhaps, and heat waves and severe weather. So I really think an individual, and I've seen that in my own little New England town, just how much one person can do. And so I would encourage all of us to get involved, get on a committee, and it's amazing what you can accomplish as a person.
Hear, hear.
All right. With that, does anyone have any final comments or any final questions or anything that they want to address? If not, I think we can conclude this webinar. So thank you everyone for joining our webinar. It was a great discussion, and especially on such a topic, which was climate change and international relations. I think I gained a lot from this discussion. So thank you to the audience for joining our webinar and for making this webinar so interactive with your questions. We hope we answered your questions, and we hope you found this valuable. Thank you to all our speakers for joining us and finding the time to, have this and participate in this discussion. And we hope you have a great day. Bye.